just one first question really to start off. What do you think the impact of the new three-child policy is likely going to be on demographic trends?
So from the survey evidence that we have from the mainland, there's not really an awful lot of hope that this is going to bring around, turn everything around. It's going to bring hundreds of millions of births, right? This is very unlikely. And even not even from evidence from the mainland, but even if we look across the region, right, in terms of other places where there have been no birth control restrictions, of course, the number of 3 or 4 child families is pretty small. The ideation for a 3 or 4 child family is pretty small. Now, that's not to say it's not going to have any influence whatsoever. So even if, like if we look back at some of the earlier surveys, we might say, well, maybe 1 or 2% of people might want to have a 3rd child. Well, in a country as big as China, that's still a lot of babies, right? This is still in the millions, right? This will still be in the millions in terms of the number of births. But also on the scale of China, that's not really going to make much of a difference in terms of the overall size and structure of the population. Now, having said that, that's not to say that it's unimportant. It's still important for those people who want to have a 3rd child, right? And again, this will run into the millions. And for those families, this represents an opportunity and a choice which they did not have before. We may also note that it can have a positive effect on the sex ratio. So the sex ratio at birth in China has always been, well, no, it's not always been actually, just in the last few decades, last couple of decades, it's been very high. And we've seen that as these policy changes come in, then the sex ratio tends to decline as well. So that may have another impact upon the sex ratio at birth. But is it going to fix China's demographic problems? Almost certainly not.
You say there's not much of an appetite, for people to have an additional child. What do you think is driving that?
Well, I would say that you've got to look at the context of family formation and childbearing in not just in China, but in this part of the world more generally. So firstly, we can look at the direct costs of childbearing. So having a child, actually, firstly, getting married, the actual wedding itself is very expensive. Then all of the costs associated with childbearing are expensive, and child rearing are expensive, particularly things like if you're a middle class family, the costs of education, particularly the costs of kind of extracurricular education are very high. But even in the countryside or for poorer families, right? The money that you have, you want to the direct costs related to children, you want to minimize to be able to support a smaller number of children to really make a success of their life. But then we also have, I would say, very high indirect or opportunity costs of childbearing, and particularly in terms of the impact upon women's careers and on women's female kind of career progression. And a lot of this comes from this kind of unequal gender dynamics, which are not just in the workplace, as it's very clear in the workplace, but then also in the home as well. So a very unequal in terms of responsibilities for childcare and domestic work. And finally, I would say that it's not just about child rearing, but it's actually about the whole kind of care system as well. That if you also have obligations for care of the parents and for parents-in-law, then that and if those disproportionately fall upon the shoulders of women, that adds another factor. So in China, we talk about this kind of 4-2-1 issue, right? So you have 2 people in the middle, 2 sets of parents and 1 child historically. Well, then adding another one to that, and then yet another one, so you have like 4-2-3. So you've got 2 people in the middle, potentially looking after 7 people. So 2 sets of parents and then 3 kids. And then if that is really just, if the burden of care is on the shoulder of women, then it's really, 4-1-3. So then that becomes that's completely impossible. And so what I think would be needed to shift that, to change that, would be a number of things, which would be so supporting that downward care need, right? And this is in the current 5-year plan in terms of family policy, in terms of kindergarten support, childcare, that's to lower the burden of care in terms of families looking after their, for their children, and being better, particularly for women, to be able to better combine work and family without the current very, very strong detriment to their career as well. But then I would also argue there's an upward care burden that we have to consider as well. And this might seem slightly kind of counterintuitive, but it's precisely why your ILC might be interested in precisely this kind of issue, that if you want to support people to free up resources, right, if you will, to have more children, maybe you need to invest in better care for older people, right? That actually you remove that upward generational burden, or you lessen that upward generational burden as well. Now, then the question is whether or not, well, do we need to have more children, right? Do we have to increase the fertility rate? And there, of course, that again is a slightly tricky question. So many people would say, well, yes, of course, if China is aging very rapidly and the population is going to decline, this is very bad for the economy, for pension systems, for social security, and so on. And more babies will fix this. Well, having more babies, it's not going to fix the pension system, because as I keep having to say, babies don't work, right? And these days, a child born today in China, where we have very, very high rates now of educational attainment, and particularly of higher educational attainment, even going up to the master's level, a child born today is probably, the average child is probably not going to enter the labour market until what, 2040, 2042, 2043, something like that. By which time the labour market will be completely different anyway. In terms of the need for labour, that's going to be completely different anyway, because of, you would imagine, because of the continuing trend in automation and technology and innovation and AI and so on. So we just won't need that many people working in factories, because the economy will change. But also by 2035, there is the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences have already estimated that's the date when the urban pension fund will become insolvent. So it's not going to make that much. It's not, having more babies doesn't fix the pension system. Fixing the pension system fixes the pension system, right? And I think that's the challenge, that we look at a demographic problem and then try and find a demographic solution, whereas that's not the way to do it. We see a demographic problem related to an institutional problem, right? An institutional challenge. And then, yes, you can work on the demographic side, but you also have to fix the institutional systems as well. And that's really, I think, where China is. I mean, it's not where it has to go. This is the thing. At the moment, everybody's talking, oh, but if China doesn't do anything, it's going to be, but they are doing things, right? It's part of the plan, right? To work on these challenges relating to aging, and they are going to bring about reforms in this area for sure.
Just a quick point to pick up on, you mentioned sort of 4-2-1 family structure, and obviously, China's a big place, very diverse. Is it the same in sort of rural settings?
Yeah, so of course that 4-2-1 system is a kind of a generalization, right? And yes, of course, there'll be certain differences in different areas. We would say that, and of course, not all of that is a burden. Of course, we have intergenerational support from older ages, right? So we have very, very strong grandparental support coming down from these from the older generations to support the parents in the middle there as well. But then in some places, we also will have even more generations, right? So we will actually have younger people and their parents and their grandparents, right? So having to support multiple generations within one family unit. Now, then, of course, then you have to add in migration as well. So different people will be moving around in different parts of the country. So that's going to add a kind of complicating factor there. So it is a very oversimplified way of looking at this. But it is indicative, though, of how we have to consider how all of these generations are in one way or another joined together and tied together. And any policy intervention that doesn't really consider this could end up having kind of negative, unforeseen consequences, right? So we talk, for example, about changing the retirement age. So this is already kind of part of the plan. This is inevitable. This is, well, I say inevitable, it's almost certain to happen in the near future, right? So at the moment, the retirement age for males in the public sector, state-owned enterprises, is 60, is 55 for women in white-collar jobs, and 50 for women in blue-collar jobs. But this is very, very low in an international comparison. So the plan is to increase that. You said that's perfectly reasonable. But and of course, this is going to be very unpopular. So, well, when I say it's perfectly reasonable from like a public financing perspective, right? This is not going to be perfectly reasonable if you're a 54-year-old woman who's expecting to retire next year, right? This is going to be very unreasonable. So this is going to be unpopular for people around retirement age at the moment. But you also have to recognize, as I said before, these intergenerational care responsibilities, which go both ways. So if you increase the retirement age and then you actually withdraw a source of grandparental childcare for younger people, then you can actually make matters worse, right? You can push down the fertility rate even further because you are making it even hard by saying, well, older people should be working for more years. If you don't substitute that grandparental care with some other form of childcare, then you're actually making the process of childbearing and child rearing even harder. And similarly as well, if younger people, they're very concerned about being able to access decent jobs, being able to access decent employment, and so therefore you run the risk of creating or deepening this intergenerational rift. If you say, well, we're going to increase the retirement age by 10 years, by 15 years, or whatever it may be, and then if younger people start to, well, but then that's not fair because I want the jobs which would have been freed up through retirement. Now, of course, it doesn't work like that, right? It's not as simple as that younger people are taking jobs which then get kind of refreshed or recycled. It doesn't work like that. But that's the way that, unless it's communicated, unless this whole intergenerational relationships in this kind of in this holistic process is communicated effectively, then it could end up being quite tricky, actually.
So you touched on it, but where do you think intergenerational relations sort of in China are today? What do you think? Where do you think they're headed?
It's really interesting. I think it's really difficult to say, partly because it has just changed so quickly. It's changed so rapidly, right? And it's not so much that So in some ways, things have stayed constant, right? Some things have stayed constant. I think that the ideas, or at least aspirations, about parental roles and grandparental roles, and kind of looking at of a respect and of a kind of a notion of wanting or of a feeling that one should be supporting each other. And particularly in terms of upward care, that's not gone, right? That's not disappeared. But at the same time, the worlds in which older people and younger people are inhabiting, and their common reference points, if you will, really are changing extremely dramatically, particularly in the big cities, right? Particularly in the first and second tier cities, and I think that's a bit of a challenge. And then I guess the issue, culturally, in terms of attitudes, are these going to change as well? How flexible and how plastic are these attitudes? And again, we look elsewhere in the region. we can see, that older, if you look at kind of bosses, right? You look at older, you look at politicians, right? Across the region, these are predominantly older males. And so when you have older males making policies and making decisions which will impact the lives of younger females, if those reference points are so far apart, and if they're being pulled apart further, then at what point did they kind of break? At what point did they snap? And we see this just last week in Japan. But the law, the government are going to enforce this law which says that that women have to take, you can only have one surname, right? That if you get married, that you have to take the surname of your husband, right? So therefore that you say, well, that's kind of like that's a 5-step back, right? Whereas on the other hand, we have one step forward, this kind of Kutu movement. The women in Japan said, well, we don't respect these rules of having to wear these particular shoes to work, right? You as older men expect us to dress like this for work, but we don't want to, right? That's not what we believe, and because that's not our expectation that we should do that anymore. So, it's almost like we go one step forward and then 5 steps back with relation to gender equality, for example, right? And that's really how I think this intergenerational divide is going to play itself out, I think, with these different attitudes about work and family and gender. It's not like an all-out conflict by any means, but it's just a series of negotiations and discussions and arguments and about what is normal, because for different generations, for younger people, for middle-aged people, for older people, their expectations, their concepts are going to be completely different.
And this thing really, of potentially longer lives, but also fewer children, it's probably going to sort of impact all generations, really. And you mentioned before, there's a plan, but how ready do you think China really is to adapt to a changing society?
I think well, let's take the pros and the cons, right? So the kind of the con, or on the bad side, it is said that like this whole thing of, well, China will get old before it gets rich. You hear this quite a lot. I'm never entirely sure what that really means, right? Okay, so it is, and in some ways it's kind of a sign of its success in many ways, right? That it's not just the one-child policy that has pushed down the fertility, that has affected demographic change in China, right? China has always been, health and mortality in China in the last few decades has always been higher than where it should have been for its kind of income status, right? So mortality has been pretty low. Fertility was already declining rapidly in the 70s anyway, and would have continued to decline. I'm pretty almost certain would have continued to decline in the 80s and 90s because of all the different because of the processes of urbanization and industrialization and female labor force participation and all these other different things. So one-child policy then just kind of exaggerated a trend that was already in existence, and so in that sense, it's got old, right? But it's got old through this kind of pretty standard but very accelerated process of development. So therefore, the question is, well, what does it mean about getting rich? Well, is that when we talk about getting rich, does that mean getting rich like everybody is rich, right? Everybody's living like Switzerland or Luxembourg or something like this. Or does it mean that the country is able to afford the things which we associate with richer countries, like a large welfare state, like a large pension system, like a large health and long-term care system? Well, of course, it's not at the stage where it can afford a Swedish-style welfare state, right? Or even a British-style welfare state, right? There's still going to be quite some way away from that, even though there is a strong demand for that. But then the question is, but is that the only model that's out there? And that's where I think China does have certain advantages, that by aging a little bit further down the line from other countries, it can actually learn the lessons from other parts of the world and design a system which is a little bit more sustainable, which is more resilient to these long-term changes which are coming ahead. And the institutions that already exist, they can be, they're not so old, right? They're not so entrenched and so developed that any reform becomes very difficult. In the UK, any attempts to reform the NHS are very, very difficult, right? Because we're so used to the NHS, right? It's been around for 70 years and it's become like a part of the national psyche, right? And so any attempts to change it become politically very charged. Now, China's institutions in relation to health and welfare are pretty young, right? So they'll still be able to be adapted. China's political system is better suited to dealing with these big structural megatrends, right? Because it can think about changes over 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years and plan over such a long period of time without having to go through the kind of zigzag of policy that we relate to that we relate with the electoral cycle that we would see in democratic societies, right? So in that sense, China has this another inbuilt advantage. And then finally, I would say that, and that goes back to this whole issue of getting old, quote unquote, quite quickly. Yes, it's got older quickly, but it's also really moving up in terms of educational attainment, in terms of skills, in terms of health, in terms of poverty alleviation. When the government says we're going to alleviate, we're going to eradicate extreme poverty, we're going to eradicate poverty, we're going to we have a healthy China 2030 program. These are things which are going to change the nature of that change the nature of human capital in China. So when you put all of those things together, there's actually a lot more there's a lot more levers to pull, right? There's a lot more possibilities than if it were only just in terms of demographic change.